All we need to do now is to let the Iranians know that we are on their side and that we will not tolerate this criminal regime anymore, and apply much more pressure on the Iranian officials, which will then widen the existing crack and will result in many of the loyalists jumping ship, emboldening Iranians to overthrow this regime. We need to take the following actions if we are to avoid war. And in case if it comes to war, we gotta ask one question. Are we going to fight them now, or are we going to fight them when they have the nuclear bomb? We need to provide a direct channel of communication to the people of Iran where information is shared and where the opposition can guide support for their cause. Unfortunately, Voice of America has failed to do so. This entity has chosen to depoliticize their network and instead provide entertainment to the Iranians. This is not what they need. They need guidance, they need hope, and they need support. And the worst fear that the regime has, and has had ever since the revolution, has been these broadcasts from out of the country where they unite the people and provide accurate information and tell them what they need to do. We then need to do the following: pursuit of Iranian leaders for crimes against humanity, arrest warrants issued asking Interpol and other countries to enforce such warrants, and freezing all their bank accounts. Convincing our European allies to reduce diplomatic ties to a minimum staff and to completely halt all their commerce with Iran, going as far as refusing airspace and shipping ports to any vessel to or from Iran. Deporting all Iranian agents from Western countries. We know who they are, working out of Iranian banks, Islamic cultural centers, mosques, shipping line, and airline offices. Again, based on my experience as a CIA agent, where I also worked a few years in Europe, I can tell you that mosques and Islamic centers, cultural centers, are being used as operational centers, and the guard members run those operations in recruitment, transferring cash and arms, and planning terrorist activities. You can even see it here in America. When Imam Faisal Abdul Rauf promotes Islam as a religion of peace, but then supports the principles of the Islamic regime and asks President Obama to not interfere in Iran and not to support the dissidents in Iran, then you can see that they have one common ideology. They don't care about principles of humanity. They don't care about freedom and democracy. Rape, torture, and execution of anyone opposing Allah is justified because Allah has demanded the rule of Islam. So once again, it's essential we understand this simple fact about their ideology. We can then understand why negotiation and sanctions will not work against the Iranian regime. There has to be clear signs that we are serious and no longer delusional with the prospects of negotiation. I can assure you that the Iranian people will respond and pick up where they left off last year and help us bring about change in Iran. Thank you and God bless.
Thank you, Reza. We'll all be available for interviews after this event. We're moving it along because of the time for this room and for what the National Press Club has allotted. And I want to take this opportunity to thank Reza and also point out that he has written a book called Time to Betray. You can find it in the bookstores. You can find it on our website at freedomwatchusa.org. It's available for sale. It's a great lesson in history. It's a lesson in what this country needs to do, not just for Iran, but for itself. I want to now turn the presentation over to another good friend, a colleague who I've worked with over the years, the individual who runs the group which is co-sponsoring this event, the Foundation for Democracy in Iran, a true expert on Iran, the Middle East, and national security. He wrote an editorial today that's in the newspaper. I call your attention to it in the Washington Times. It's called VOA's Duplicitous Broadcasts. Persian News Network defends Mullah's interests, not America's. We're going to be talking about that in the next half hour. Ken Timmerman. Thank you, Ken.
Thank you, Larry, and it's a pleasure to be here at such illustrious company. Ambassador Keyes, we had an interesting dinner together not long before, and I will certainly not try to rival your eloquence and your insight and your vision, and I salute you, sir. It's a pleasure to be here with you. The Foundation for Democracy in Iran, which I preside, has been in existence since 1995. Let me tell you very briefly the kinds of things that we do. We work with Iranian opposition. We work with the pro-freedom movement. We've been doing this for about 15 years. And I would like to get very specific in the few minutes that I'm going to speak to you today about the kinds of things that the U.S. government and the 112th Congress can do to help the pro-freedom movement. Number one, they're a lot stronger than people think. We saw the repression in Iran. We saw the way that the regime would mercilessly cut down people on the streets, shoot them from the rooftops, drive over them with pickup trucks. And yet millions of people came to the streets, and millions of people will come to the streets again. They were crying out for help, and the United States remained silent. When President Obama waited for over 2 weeks to say anything about the protests in Tehran, in Isfahan, in Tabriz, in Bandar Abbas, in Mashhad, all across the country, people were on the streets protesting the regime. Obama and the United States government remained silent. The regime ultimately took that as a sign of approval, and they used his name as a play on words to mock the protesters. And they said in Persian, Ubamast. It means, he's with us. And they held up Obama's picture, and they said, he's with us. He's with the regime. This was certainly not what President Obama intended, I would hope. Nevertheless, it's the way that his silence was used by the regime to discourage the protesters and ultimately, I believe, to reinforce the regime itself. We can do a lot. Today we are doing absolutely nothing to help the pro-freedom movement in Iran. As Larry mentioned, I have an op-ed today in the Washington Times about the Voice of America. We are spending huge amounts of money at VOA and the Persian News Network. We have quadrupled the service. And yet, the more money we spend, the worse it gets. In fact, the PNN has become a disgrace and a disservice to U.S. policy. It is helping the regime in Tehran and not furthering the goals of freedom, not furthering the values on which this country has been established, not furthering the charter itself, a Voice of America, to promote freedom and a quest for liberty around the world. The managing editor of Voice of America, who I name in this article, he is the son of an Ayatollah in Tehran. His brother works for the central bank in a very senior position, and yet he claims on air that this makes no difference whatsoever, and of course he is just an objective observer and editing the news. But I ask you, look at some of the decisions that Sayyid Ali Sajadi has made as managing editor of the Voice of America. He was the one who decided, after Nida Aga Sultan, a young bystander, a 26-year-old girl in Tehran, was gunned down in cold blood. She was dying on the streets. She wasn't even part of the protests at that moment. She was a bystander. And people had captured her death on the streets of Tehran with a cell phone video. It went out over the internet, almost instantly became viral. She became the image of the suffering people of Iran. Every network in the world broadcast that footage, except for one, the Voice of America's Persian News Network. They waited 3 days before they finally broadcast that video, and that decision was made by Sayyid Ali Sajadi. I believe that Congress can do a great deal in the coming year and 2 years of the 112th Congress to conduct oversight over the administration's policies. We need to know, for example, what kind of interagency talks there have been between the State Department, the Treasury Department, and Voice of America to stop VOA from becoming the voice of freedom and to help it to become the voice of the mullahs. We need to know, for example, why the State Department continues to refuse to name and shame the companies who are helping the regime of the Islamic Republic of Iran. We have sanctions on the books here in the United States. We have sanctions at the United Nations that call for these companies to be named and shamed, for them not to do business here in the United States. The State Department refuses to name them. We need to name those companies. We need to get the records of the Obama administration in what they have actually negotiated and promised to Ahmadinejad. We don't know that. We know that the president has sent 2 letters to Tehran asking them for negotiations. We don't know what was on the table. There's an awful lot that we need to know. Finally, let me just say a couple more things. I think we should model, Congress should ask for an Iran Security Commission, just as we have the China Security Commission that was set up after the Clinton administration's failed policies in transferring technology to communist China. We should have an Iran Security Commission that looks at Iranian penetration of the United States, of U.S. institutions, of the U.S. government, of the U.S. media, of Iranian agents acting here in this country. And ultimately, we should also have greater funding for the pro-freedom movement. We work at the Foundation for Democracy on Iran with groups from across the political spectrum, from across the ethnic spectrum in Iran. What a lot of people don't know here is that Iran is not just ancient Persia. Iran, as a nation state, is comprised of Kurds, of Azeris, of Baluchis, of Avazis, and a whole lot of other ethnic minorities. They are all Iranians, and they are all being oppressed by the current regime in Tehran. Our job as a foundation is to serve as an honest broker to help bring some of these groups together, and I'm telling you, with help from the United States, with help from Europe, from European governments, the people of Iran will triumph, and they will get rid of this regime. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken.